When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, peace did not come easily. For millions across the world, it was a time to return home, to rebuild, to heal, to start again. But for thousands of captured German soldiers, now prisoners of war, scattered across America, home no longer felt like home at all. They had crossed an ocean to fight for a cause they barely understood. And somewhere between the blood and the orders, their world had collapsed. Yet here, in the heart of America, behind the barbed wire of strange, faraway camps, something unexpected happened. The men who had once fought for Hitler found kindness in the most unlikely of places. They were greeted not by hatred, but by farmers offering bread, by children waving from fences, by guards who spoke softly and sometimes even shared cigarettes through the wire. In towns across Texas, Georgia, and Louisiana, German POWs became part of a strange new routine. They woke with the dawn, worked in the fields, repaired fences, built barns, and in return they were paid small wages, enough to buy a few comforts from the camp canteen. But beyond the rations and rules, something deeper began to take root. It was peace, a peace they hadn't known in years. Inside those camps, the prisoners found freedom of a different kind, freedom from propaganda, from fear, from the weight of a war that had crushed their generation. They began to paint, to write, to sing. In Camp Aliceville, Alabama, a POW orchestra played music that drifted beyond the wire, and locals would gather outside just to listen. In Nebraska, German carpenters built furniture for American families. In Louisiana, they harvested crops side by side with the very people who had lost sons to the war. And as months turned into years, something remarkable happened. The line between prisoner and neighbor began to blur. A guard might ask a POW for help fixing a tractor. Farmer's wife might bring extra bread to the men, working her fields. At Christmas, they exchanged cards. At Easter, they prayed together. For many of these young Germans, barely 19 or 20 years old, it was the first time they felt seen not as soldiers, not as enemies, but as human beings. Then came the letters from home. Germany was gone, cities burned, families scattered, and hunger stalked the streets of what used to be their homeland. Mothers wrote of houses reduced to rubble. Brothers were missing, fathers dead, sisters starving. For the first time, the prisoners in America felt a strange, silent dread. The war might be over. But what awaited them across the Atlantic was not victory. It was ruin. When the Allied command announced repatriations in late 1945, trains began to roll toward the ports, but not every man was eager to board. In Camp Ruston, Louisiana, a small group of POWs gathered near the fence. One of them, a young man named Carl Muller, stared at the American horizon. He whispered to his friend, "Back there, there's nothing left. But here, I'm alive." The others nodded. They knew what he meant. For them, captivity had become a kind of salvation. They had been taken prisoner as enemies, but they had found something their country had stolen from them long before. Decency, respect, and a chance to start again. Some wrote petitions to stay. Others married local women in secret. A few even escaped, not to run away, but to disappear into the quiet corners of the American countryside. In one letter preserved from that time, a German POW wrote, "We came here in chains, but our hearts were freed." As ships began to carry thousands back to Europe, many wept openly on the docks. They looked at the waving Americans on shore, the same people who had once been their enemies, and they realized something powerful. They no longer hated them. In fact, some now called them friends. This was not just the end of a war. For these men, it was the beginning of a strange, fragile peace. One they weren't sure would survive once they stepped back onto German soil. The war had taken everything from them, but in a foreign land, In the shadow of defeat, they had found a new kind of humanity. Music fades. The sound of a ship horn echoes, carrying their voices across the ocean. They were going home, but their hearts were staying behind. The ships left American shores heavy with silence. Hundreds of German prisoners stood on the decks, their eyes fixed on the fading coastline. Behind them lay the strange comfort of captivity. Ahead, the unknown wasteland of a home they hadn't seen in years. They were soldiers no longer. No flags, no uniforms of pride, just men with empty hands and heavier hearts. Some carried photographs given by American families, smiling faces of children they had played with, letters signed, "Your friend Tommy." Others clutched small trinkets, a Bible, a carved wooden cross, a harmonica. For many, these were their only possessions, symbols of a gentler world they'd found on the other side of the wire. As the ships crossed the Atlantic, they talked quietly among themselves. What would they find in Germany now? Would their towns still stand? Would anyone be waiting? The answers arrived long before they reached port. At the docks of Le Havre and Bremen, the smell of smoke and ash carried on the wind. Ruins stretched as far as the eye could see. Once proud cities, Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, now lay in piles of blackened stone. Children wandered barefoot through the rubble, searching for food. Old women waited at train stations for sons who would never return. And when the returning POWs stepped off those ships, they were greeted not as heroes, but as ghosts from a past everyone wanted to forget. For many Germans, these returning men represented the shame of a lost war. They had surrendered, they had lived, while others had died. Neighbors looked at them with suspicion. The new government had no jobs to offer, no homes to give, and no patience for the broken. In one camp near Hamburg, a repatriated soldier described his first night home. "I slept in the street. There was no house, no mother, no light. I heard rats in the dark and thought, I should have stayed in America." The Allied occupation was underway. Germany was divided, East and West, split by politics, fear, and foreign flags. The streets of Berlin were patrolled by Soviet tanks. Hunger lines stretched for blocks. And amid all this ruin stood men who had once been enemies of the world, now lost in their own homeland. Some were questioned by Allied officers, interrogated for war crimes they had never committed. Others were sent to re-education centers, where they were forced to watch films of the Holocaust and Nazi atrocities. For many, the guilt was unbearable. They had not known the full horror of what their country had done. Now they saw it with their own eyes, and it shattered whatever pride they still carried. In their letters back to America, they wrote words soaked in grief. "We walk among ruins. The air is gray. The people are silent. We dream of the sun over the fields of Texas." Meanwhile, back in the U.S., life went on. Farmers plowed their land, towns rebuilt, families thrived. But in quiet moments, some remembered the young Germans who had worked beside them. There were stories whispered in diners and small churches, of a POW who saved a farmer's daughter from drowning, of one who carved toys for children, of men who left behind handwritten notes that simply read, "Thank you." A few Americans even wrote letters to find them. And slowly across the broken Atlantic, a fragile exchange began. Camps were gone, but friendships survived, in paper, ink, and hope. Back in Germany, some ex-POWs found work clearing rubble or rebuilding bridges, but for many it was a life stripped of purpose. There were no uniforms now, no commands, no certainty. Only memories of the strange kindness of their captors and the laughter of foreign children who called them Mr. In time, a new rumor began to spread, that America was opening, its doors again, not for soldiers but for workers, craftsmen, and immigrants. The Marshall Plan was rebuilding Europe, and there were jobs to be had, if you had the courage to start over. And so, the letters began again. Men wrote to the American families they had known during captivity, asking if there was a place for them, on a farm, in a workshop, in a life that felt real. Some of those letters were answered. One woman in Alabama wrote back to a man named Hans Becker, a former POW who had helped harvest her cotton fields. Her letter read, "If you can come, we will welcome you as one of our own." It was more than an invitation. It was redemption. As the 1950s began, ships once again crossed the Atlantic, but this time not filled with prisoners. They carried dreamers, men returning not as captives but as free souls. They had come full circle, from war to peace, from enemies to neighbors. Yet the journey was not easy. Some were turned away, some were rejected by immigration laws, but others succeeded. And in small American towns, ex-German POWs quietly built new lives. They opened bakeries, worked in factories, started families. They never forgot the war, but they also never forgot the kindness that had changed them. And for those who stayed behind in Germany, that kindness became a ghost, a haunting memory of a land that had once been their prison, but had felt more like home than the place they were born. Soft piano fades in, melancholy yet peaceful. They had seen two worlds, one torn by hate, another stitched together by mercy. And between those worlds, they found their humanity again. But their story doesn't end there, because soon, some of them would go back. Not as soldiers, not as prisoners, but as men searching for the only place they ever truly felt free. By the early 1950s, the war was long over, but for thousands of former German prisoners, the memories of those distant American camps never faded. They were memories of sunlight over cotton fields, of laughter shared across language barriers, of the strange warmth that had turned enemies into friends. Now, those memories called to them again. The world was rebuilding, and so were they. Germany, divided and scarred, struggled to find its soul again. The old cities were being rebuilt from dust, but many hearts still felt hollow. For men who had once been POWs in America, the promise of peace felt real, but incomplete. They remembered a land where work meant dignity, where guards smiled, and the enemy offered a hand instead of a bullet. They remembered the scent of apple pie cooling on a farmhouse porch, the sound of baseball on a Sunday afternoon, and the faces of people who treated them as equals, long before they had forgiven themselves. And so, they began to return, quietly, without fanfare. They boarded ships not as captives this time, but as immigrants. Each carried little more than a suitcase, a photograph, and hope. When they arrived on American shores, the same wind that had once carried them in chains now greeted them in freedom. Many were met by the very families who had known them years before. Smiles, tears, handshakes, reunions between men once divided by war. In Alabama, a former POW named Hans Becker stepped off a train with trembling hands. Waiting for him was the farmer's daughter he had once saved from a flash flood. Now she was a woman grown, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. Her father placed a hand on Hans's shoulder and said, "You've come home, son." Stories like this were not rare. Across Texas, Louisiana, Nebraska, and the Carolinas, former POWs found work in mills, farms, and small-town bakeries. Some married, some raised children who spoke English with Southern accents. They became part of the American story, quietly, humbly, beautifully. The newspapers rarely wrote about them, but in the records of immigration offices, their names appear, once marked as enemy aliens, now listed simply as new citizens. And yet, not all could come back. For every man who returned, a dozen more stayed behind in post-war Germany, their dreams trapped between guilt and gratitude. They built new lives there too, but a part of them remained forever in that other world. A world behind American fences where humanity had returned to them piece by piece. One former soldier, writing in his journal years later, said, "I was captured by America but freed by its kindness. In Germany I was born, but in America I became a man. It was not an easy transformation." Many faced whispers. "How can you love the country that defeated us?" They answered quietly, "Because they showed us mercy when we didn't deserve it." In small towns across the United States, local families kept relics of those strange friendships: a photograph, a carved toy, a faded letter from Carl, the German boy who picked cotton with us. And on certain anniversaries, those families still told their children the story of how kindness once turned an enemy into a friend. In time, these men became old. Their hair turned silver, their hands rough with years of honest work. They paid taxes, voted in elections, sent their children to American schools. To their neighbors, they were simply Mr. Schmidt or Mr. Becker, quiet, hard-working, and polite. Few ever knew the truth, that these men had once worn the uniform of the enemy. And yet, if you asked them what freedom meant, they would not speak of politics or power. They would tell you about the day a farmer's wife shared her bread, or a guard handed him a cigarette, or a small boy called him friend. These moments, to them, were freedom. Not the kind written in constitutions, but the kind that heals the soul. In 1976, on the 30th anniversary of their return, a reunion took place in Alabama. Former American guards and German POWs, now gray-haired grandfathers, met again, this time with families beside them. They laughed, embraced, and spoke of the old days. One American veteran said, "Back then we were told they were monsters. Turns out they were just boys." The German beside him smiled and replied, "And you were the first man who ever treated me like one." There was silence, the kind that only truth can bring. For them, history had come full circle. The hatred that once divided nations had faded into something stronger: respect. Today, in forgotten cemeteries across the American South, small white crosses still stand bearing German names. Beneath those stones rest men who never made it home, not because they were denied, but because they chose peace over return. Their stories are rarely told, their graves seldom visited. But in every act of kindness that crosses borders, their legacy lives on. The war had taken everything, but in the hearts of these men, something new had been born: a faith in forgiveness, a belief that humanity can survive even the worst of wars, and perhaps that is why they never wanted to go home. Because, in a way, they already were.